Hello,
Hello,
hello, hello.
my name is Paula Latassa, and I'd like to welcome you to the commercial track of the Go Clean Energy Conference. We were trying to remember which Go Clean Energy Conference this is. I think it's like the 9th or 10th annual. So yay for 350 Deschutes for making this an annual event. It's my pleasure to introduce Devesh Nirmul. Devesh has been a longtime leader in energy, sustainability, resiliency strategy, and finance. He has demonstrated success in government and public policy, residential and commercial real estate, property management, and sustainability-focused nonprofit organizations. I've personally had the pleasure of working with Devesh and Rob Countryman, who's on the panel, to help Central Oregon get a CPACE policy passed. So I know that Devesh's passion and expertise shine when he's discussing sustainable building and development practices and steering clean energy projects in the right direction. He is creative in finding ways to fill capital stacks that make projects happen. Devesh will be moderating this session on energy efficiency and loan programs to lower costs in commercial buildings. Please join me in welcoming Devesh Nirmul.
Thank you kindly, Paula, for that great introduction. And there's so much to cover today that I think we want to make sure we have such a great brain trust here around all the different challenges and opportunities that we're seeing in the marketplace. And so really, if we can be pragmatic and find a way to connect what our challenges, what our opportunities, what our incentives together in the right kind of match, I think you're going to find there'll be a lot of follow-up that comes out of this. And I'd like to go ahead and have the panel introduce themselves. Let me just first say I have a slide up which kind of shows a portfolio of buildings of an ownership. This is done by the Rocky Mountain Institute. And this is typical. It might be that if you're a real estate owner, you might have an array of buildings in different states of performance. And part of what hopefully you can take away if you are that kind of ownership today is how do I take advantage of all those different incentives, the policy, the constraints of drivers, even in some cases, the penalties to find a path that's going to allow my business to be successful and also be future-proofed, my buildings be future-proofed. So we're trying to bring all that together. We've got finance, we've got government, we've got facilitating organizations and solution orientation organizations present today. I'll go ahead and let the panel introduce themselves, and then we'll go right into a presentation on the latest Oregon building performance standards with Blake, please.
Hi, my name is Trent Van Dyke. It's a pleasure to be here today. I'm with Earthlight Technologies. My background is in commercial real estate investment. I specialized in 1031 exchange, valuing cash flow for many, many years, and put in one of the world's longest electric vehicle highways from Prince Edward Island all the way over to Victoria back in 2010 to 2013, well before we thought this industry was going to develop. And then I've been working in the Caribbean for the past 2 years, from Aruba to USVI and all the way into San Juan, helping nonprofits and for-profits get commercial funding, and at the government level and at the private level. So it's a pleasure to be here. I live in La Pine, just bought some property, but been in and out of Bend for the past 10 years. So I'm happy to call this home now. So thank you.
All right. Good morning, everybody. I'm Andrew Shepard with Energy Trust of Oregon. Energy Trust, just so you know, that we are the folks who manage Oregon's investor-owned utility efficiency program. So all the different utilities in Oregon that are owned by investors, and that includes Portland General Electric, Northwest Natural Gas, Cascade Natural Gas, Pacific Power, and Avista. We are the folks who bring you the efficiency programs for those different utilities. I've been at Energy Trust since 2012. Before that, I was a contractor to Energy Trust for about 5 years. So I've been working in the space for quite a while. And in that time, I've worn a number of different hats. My main focus really has been on the residential side of things. But in a lot of the work that I do, I also work with our commercial team and our SEM, or strategic energy management teams. And so I've seen a lot of the different aspects of the value that we bring, to consumers. And basically just a little bit about kind of the Energy Trust mantra and why we do what we do and how we do what we do. We take funding from ratepayers that comes to us through the utilities, and we provide that money back to the ratepayers of those utilities to save energy. And all of that money needs to be justified through a cost effectiveness calculation, whereby the energy savings that we're helping Oregonians create needs to be more cost effective than creating energy through a power plant. And so everything that funds our programs in the end pencils out as being more cost effective than just a utility making power. And so that's the money that we send back into the communities and back into the ratepayers' pockets that helps businesses take that money and do all of the different capital improvements and operational improvements that they make. So everything that I talk about and everything that we promote does pencil out to be a good use of ratepayer and utility funds. So yeah.
Thank you. Hey, good morning, everyone. I'm Perry England. I am with MacDonald Miller Facility Solutions. For those that may not know who MacDonald Miller is, we're a energy construction and services business in both Washington and Oregon. So our big focus is on providing building services for building owners in the commercial real estate and public sector spaces. My particular role here on the panel today is really talking about experiences that we've had in Washington State with Washington's building performance standard, which is known as the Clean Buildings Standard. In Washington, it's been around since 2019. We were early in the marketplace working with building owners and our customer base to be able to help them comply with the legislation, and then been working closely with Oregon, Blake specifically here to my left, in Oregon State to try to take best practices and also lessons learned in Washington and apply it to Oregon's building performance standard law. So it's a pleasure being here today. So I look forward to your tough questions. And so I'll pass it on to Blake.
Yeah, thanks. My name is Blake Shelide. I'm the manager of codes and standards at the Oregon Department of Energy. One of our roles now is to administer and develop a building performance standard for Oregon. So this policy is meant to address energy efficiency and greenhouse gas emissions in large commercial buildings, existing large commercial buildings. We've had the energy code for a long time that helps with energy efficiency in new construction, but kind of this untapped opportunity in existing buildings to unlock energy efficiency and drive cost-effective improvements in our existing building stock. So we're in the process right now of standing up a program after the legislature passed a law last year to establish building performance standards in Oregon. We're in the middle of a rulemaking process now. It's open for public comment. I'll give an overview here in a few minutes, and certainly welcome any questions or comments on it. Thanks.
Do you want to, we get two mics here, we try. Can you? Can you hear me? Can you hear? Can you guys hear me? Okay. Good morning. My name is Robert Countryman, Rob Countryman. A lot of people know me by Robert, but I'm with Countryman Capital Partners. I started Countryman Capital Partners November of 2022. After 30 years of commercial banking, I decided to go out on my own and help former clients raise debt and equity capital for commercial projects. I have a expertise or focus on CPACE, which we'll talk briefly about. But some of the building performance standards, obviously, those are impacting costs of buildings, and they're really trying to figure out how to help my clients be able to, implement those long-term, cost-effective wise. CPACE is one avenue to do that. But glad to be here today. We've got a great panel, and certainly. You think about building owners say, well, I'll do a little bit now and I'll put that off down the road. The reality is, with bigger buildings now, anything over 25,000 square feet, I think is what is Oregon's going to be. We'll need to, show reduction in carbon emissions. So, and I think if in the meeting earlier, I tell folks, 40% of kind of our emissions really is coming from embedded carbon. Everybody thinks, well, yeah, vehicles, that's one, transportation vehicles is one avenue, but if you look at 40% industrial buildings, commercial buildings, that's our biggest opportunity, I think, reduce carbon emissions. So anyways, glad to be part of this panel. With that, I will turn it back over to Devesh.
Okay, great. So we definitely have the right to diversity of panelists here, and I'll just comment with Energy Trust. I think Oregon has just got such a great set of resources. Rob and I recently had a client that was doing a multifamily property and was looking to do some grid resiliency, and there were some obviously some soft cost assistance that can be had through Energy Trust to actually enable that pre-design sort of support, which is uncommon, I think, in the country to find that type of level of support. So definitely taking advantage of what's already there, but also fitting into the new policies and is a great opportunity. Can I get a sense of who's in the room vis-a-vis building owners, renewable energy providers, consultants, engineers? Like what's the mixed? Maybe we'll start with the building owner community, real estate brokers. Okay. Renewable energy technology providers. Is that a good category to have here? Okay. Engineering consultants. Okay. And any other nonprofit facilitation? Yep. Okay. Great. Anybody else want to comment on what who they're brewery? Yep, that's building owner. I said building owners, but I should have said type of business. Thank you for that. Yeah. Construction. Okay. Contractors. Great. Okay. So in that case, I think everybody wants to learn from what's going on with the state policy. We'll turn it over to Blake. Please go ahead. Talk to us about BPS, please.
Yeah. I don't have too many slides, so we can probably just advance through. Yeah. There we go. Great. Thanks. All right, so I'll give a quick overview of the policy and program and kind of current activity. This is just our agency's mission. But BPS was passed last year in House Bill 3409, meant to address energy efficiency in large commercial buildings, which make up about 20% of our statewide greenhouse gas emissions. It's modeled after an ASHRAE standard 100, and also pretty closely modeled after Washington State's program, if anyone's familiar with what's been going on to our neighbors to the north over the past few years. We're about 2 to 3 years behind where Washington is in their process in terms of compliance dates. This graphic depicts what buildings are going to be covered buildings in Oregon. The legislation defines 2 tiers of buildings, tier 1 buildings and tier 2 buildings. Tier 1 buildings are generally those larger, greater than 35,000 square feet buildings that are non-residential hotels and motels. So depending on their specific size will determine their phase-in date. So the largest of those buildings will have to start compliance by June of 2028, 1 year later for 90,000 square feet and above, and 1 year after that for 35,000 square feet and above. There's also these what are known as tier 2 buildings, which are generally certain sectors. So I think this was one kind of lesson learned from Washington too that got baked into the original legislation, where some of the sectors that are maybe a little bit more challenging to be able to raise the capital to do energy projects, to plan out, develop those energy management plans, are now tier 2 buildings that don't have a full requirement for meeting a building performance standard, but just need to benchmark their energy usage and report that to us. And then one of the things that we're tasked with over the next 5 or 6 years is to potentially develop and recommend a full BPS for those tier 2 buildings. But those are the multifamily buildings, hospitals, schools, and dormitories, and university buildings. And then also included in tier 2 that need to just benchmark their energy usage are the smaller between 20 and 35,000 square feet commercial buildings to us. This is just the language straight from the legislation that pretty much defines the same thing that I showed on that last graph. So what does compliance mean for the building performance standard? The most simple pathway to compliance will be meeting an energy use target. We in Oregon define the energy use target based on site energy usage. So it's based on the energy usage at the site, not at the source, like what it takes to generate that that energy, maybe at the electricity plant. It's not based on greenhouse gas emissions. It's based on site energy use, like kilowatt hours, natural gas therms converted to BTUs, all to this metric that I think a lot of folks are familiar with, but known as EUI, energy use intensity. It's you take the total energy summed up over the course of a year, divided by the building's square footage, and that's the performance metric. So that's kind of the most straightforward pathway for compliance, meeting this EUI, whether or not a building might already meet it or has to do some energy projects to get there. That's one method for compliance. There's also an investment criteria pathway where a building could feasibly, if they're not meeting an energy target, conduct an energy audit, implement an optimized bundle of cost-effective measures. And even if they don't necessarily get down to that energy target, as long as they've implemented the measures, done the audit, they could still comply via that pathway. There are a number of eligible exemptions also that would qualify for the program too, where a building wouldn't necessarily need to meet the EUI target or do an energy audit if they qualify for one of these exemptions. But these are still covered buildings. They would need to apply and receive an exemption. There is the potential for penalties. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but not a situation that we'd be like really looking for. Our ideal situation is compliance for all the buildings, right? But there is that component to the program where we would be able to enforce a compliance penalty for a non-compliant building after compliance. So where are we in the process? Right now, we've been working with a rulemaking advisory committee over the course of this year. We've held 7 or 8 meetings with the RAC, in addition to about 4 public meetings, gathering input, learning from the Washington process, learning from our stakeholders about the best policy decisions for Oregon as we develop these draft rules to stand up the program. Right now, we are toward the end of the year. We have to complete our rulemaking by the end of the year. It's open for public comment now. We filed our draft rules with the Oregon Secretary of State late last week. All the drafts are up on our website. We're accepting comments from now until the middle of November, where we'll hold a public comment hearing. And then we'll take the time between mid-November and the end of the year to finalize our rules for final publishing by the end of the year. By the middle of next year, we'll be identifying to the best that we can all the covered building owners. So we're working with our county tax assessors now to gather the data for all the buildings that meet those square footage thresholds, get building owner data and information so that we can actually contact the building owners. You can imagine there's not like one central location where you can just filter for all buildings over 35,000 square feet or over 20,000 square feet. So that process is somewhat of a lot of work to get that done. But we're working on that now with our tax assessors, and the data's coming from tax assessors in all different sorts of forms. So, but that all kind of leads into a few years between when the rules are filed and when building owners need to comply. So there's about a 3 or 4 year runway for when building owners can figure out where they sit relative to the targets, what they might need to do to get into compliance, and then have a few years to make that happen for the largest buildings, and then even another year or 2 for the next phase of buildings too. This just shows some of the activity that we've done this year to develop the program and all the work with stakeholders that we've made. We've had a series of RAC meetings, rulemaking advisory committee meetings, public meetings, filing our draft rules last week. We've got a rulemaking hearing in mid-November, and then finishing up by the end of the year. And this just kind of shows the same process. Right now, we're in this phase where we're accepting comments, formal public review period. And all those rules are posted up on the website, including all the draft rules for like reporting requirements, our modifications of Standard 100, this concept of utility data aggregation, requiring some utilities where a building owner requests aggregated building data where you might have multiple meters to be able to provide that to the owner so that they can determine compliance and report. And these are just all the chapters of the rules that are up on the website, and kind of what goes into each chapter. And then there's a whole appendix that defines that investment criteria pathway for a building owner that's not meeting that EUI target, what they need to do to determine what's a cost-effective measure and that optimized bundle of measures to comply. And then, here we are today, filed our rules last week and accepting comments. And then by the middle of next year, one of our tasks is to notify building owners. We think that there's probably about 5,000 covered buildings in Oregon, tier 1 buildings, and maybe another 5,000 to 10,000 tier 2 buildings that need to report to us. But those are just kind of preliminary numbers now based on some of the city of Portland benchmarking data scaled up to the state. So we'll get a lot more detailed data on that as we actually start to get good information from our counties and from other sources too. But one thing I'm really excited about is having like really interesting, really granular and really robust energy data on our building sector in Oregon that we really haven't had in the future. So in like 5 years, we'll have, I think, a really robust data set that'll really help us to determine where the opportunities are, help us kind of shape policy even more. And then the last thing that I'll mention too, we will be standing up an incentive program to implement BPS for either early or voluntary adoption. So if a building isn't covered but wants to comply, they can receive some incentives for doing that or complying early with the program before their compliance date kicks in. And then also, just because Diane asked me to mention it too, even though we're not really focused on residential buildings, but our office is also administering, and this isn't really my area, but a number of residential efficiency incentive projects from some of the federal funding that's happened over the past couple of years. The HOMES program, the HERE program for residential energy efficiency and electrification projects. Those programs aren't available yet. The funding's not available yet, but we're working with the U.S. Department of Energy to define what those, what our administration of that program looks like. So, and this is just an example of some of the potential incentives that will be available once those programs kick in. And then the timeline for that. So we're in the process of developing it now. And then kind of by, I think, middle of next year, it's not really any dates on here, but I think sometime next year is when it's expected to be available. And that covers my portion of the presentation. So thanks. Look forward to hearing from some of the other folks on the panel about, like, because one of the challenges that, you know, we know is going to exist in the marketplace is, okay, working with building owners now that these requirements are in place, working with building owners to figure out the best pathways for compliance. And that's, I think, where a lot, and some of the funding and financing that can help them get there. I think that's where a lot of the other panelists kick in. So thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Blake. Yeah. Do we have any quick burning question? We'll leave plenty of time for questions at the end, but just want to make sure, check to see if there's something somebody wants to bring up really quick. Yeah. Yeah. So as an agency, we won't be the ones going out to do audits, but part of the rulemaking, similar to the Washington process, defines what it. Oh, thanks. Yeah. So the question was around who will do the energy audits for a building to figure out what it needs to do to comply. So part of our rulemaking defines what it means to be a qualified energy auditor, and there's a number of certifications that would meet that requirement, including the AEE's Certified Energy Auditor certification. ASHRAE has a building energy assessment certification as well that would qualify, and there's a few others in there too. So those certified professionals would be the ones that are out there going out, performing audits, helping a building owner to understand what measures are required to comply. Yep. Yeah, we'll take two.
Yeah, so the question was around enforcement. That the compliance penalty piece would fall on our agency to potentially impose those enforcement compliance penalties. But it wouldn't be after 25, it would be after 2028, right when the first compliance dates kick in. Yep.
Sure.
Yeah, thanks.
I don't know if it's applicable or not, but the energy state contracting, that's something that we get away from the government and cross over to the private sector as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think we certainly see those sort of solutions like energy performance contracting as a pathway to help building owners meet compliance, right? And I think Perry's probably going to talk a lot about that as in his portion of the panel too. So, yep. Yeah. Yeah.
Before we get to compliance and penalties and all that, I'd like to hear more about some of the incentives that are on.
Right. Yeah. I understand that. So we did get some funding from the legislature, $2 million to provide incentives. And then we've actually applied for additional federal funding. I think it's about 10 or $12 million to kind of, and we've received that to increase our total bucket of incentives that we could provide. It's up to 85 cents a square foot for buildings that voluntarily or early comply with the program. We haven't yet defined the process and the administrative elements for what it would require to apply and be eligible to receive that funding. That'll be something that we work on starting kind of now after we've finished the administrative rules and into next year, that we look to probably have mostly defined by the middle of next year so that a building owner could apply for those. But I don't have a lot of specifics to be able to offer you now, but we will be engaging in a lot of public opportunities for input for that program too. So, but definitely understand that that will be an appealing pathway for a number of building owners.
And maybe, to that question, and Blake, this is kind of a question back to you. Energy Trust of Oregon, we certainly provide a lot of incentives to projects for voluntary capital improvements. And so I guess my question would be to you is, if a building is having to make improvements to comply, my understanding is that Energy Trust incentives would still be available, and those buildings would be eligible for our incentives to comply with the standards. Is that correct?
That's right.
All right. Yeah.
We certainly look to partner with all the utilities, Energy Trust in Oregon, and other utilities that help provide the financing and incentives for building owners to meet the BPS requirements. Yep.
Yeah. Go ahead. We have a little bit of time. This is important. Go ahead. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, it's a good question. So like, when does a new building become an existing building, right? So yeah, other than the exemptions in the statute around not having a certificate of occupancy for like a full 12 months. So once a building pretty much has a certificate of occupancy for 12 months, it would become an existing building and also be required to comply. I don't think I mentioned it before, but the energy use targets are set as like the most stringent that they can be is the average building in our building stock. And that's the way that our targets have been set. That's the way that our draft rules are structured, and our draft targets are proposed. So it's our expectation that a new building built in Oregon, and in just about every case with Oregon having a pretty advanced energy efficiency code for its new construction, would would perform better than the average building. So, yeah. I think so. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there will be cases where a new building might need to look at its EUI and figure out how it performs relative to the target. But our expectation is that a new building's very efficient and would meet the targets in most cases. Yep.
Got it. And I just want to make sure, these are all great questions and points. Let's make sure we continue that. Could go back. And Perry, when you mentioned performance contracting, you're referring to like energy savings agreements, which are a private sector solution that's
allowing that program to have spillover right now.
Right. So we'll touch upon ESAs a bit, but that's a kind of an equivalency.
Yeah.
And Perry can do that as well. He knows plenty of implementation on that. And I'm going to just add, I think with EUI and the targets, I'm big into O&M on buildings, right? So you can build a green building, but how do you run it green and maintain those performance targets? So is there anything built in to enable these properties to have the ability to track and fault detect and do continuous commissioning, the type of things that you want to see happen? Maybe Perry, we can get into that deeper later, but I'm throwing that to the audience too. As we build these projects, we want to start to build in that infrastructure, and you can finance that. The soft costs, all the soft cost, design, engineering, prepaid maintenance. Those are the kind of things we need to be thinking about in advance, I think. So appreciate all the input. We'll continue. Right now, we're actually going to shift over to Perry. Perry, you've had experience with the Washington BPS program, and particularly how do building owners right now, what challenges are they facing? What opportunities are they seeing with deployment and implementation? Got your slide up, by the way, for the.
Okay. That's an example of a project that is going through multi-phases to achieve their energy use target, their weighted energy use target. So I think the biggest, right now, Washington State's had it has the law in place since 2019. Our rules were published at the end of 2020. And then the legislature expanded the compliance of the Washington State Clean Buildings Performance Standard Law in 2022 to expanded it to cover buildings which are classified as Tier 2 buildings down to 20,000 square feet. So Tier 1 buildings in Washington State are 50,000 square feet and larger, both public and private. That's the big difference between the two laws. Tier 1's defined differently in Oregon versus Washington. And then Tier 2 in Washington is 20 to 50,000 square feet. So all the remaining building population, similar to Oregon's legislation for Tier 2 in the commercial real estate industry. So with that, this delineation, I think it's important because people are getting confused between Washington and Oregon laws based on the classification of tiers. So that's why I bring that up. The biggest challenge right now, we've been working, Department of Commerce is the agency having jurisdiction for Washington State for compliance, similar to Oregon Department of Energy with Blake's team. So that's the other nuances. So I only say that just for clarity in case I use commerce versus ODO in my responses. So right now, once building owners are aware of the legislation, which is still a challenge, right? So it goes beyond what you were asking, Devesh. But once they're aware of it, going through the compliance, how do I get started? That's the next step. And as you see here in the Maidenbauer Center example, it was basically starting with getting their Energy Star portfolio manager stood up, understanding what Energy Star portfolio manager is, which is also a requirement in Oregon as the reporting tool. And then moving through the benchmarking exercise and understanding where they sit as it pertains to meeting their performance standard, their target. In this particular example, this property was 40 points above their target. So they used 40,000 British thermal units more energy per year than what the law says they should be performing at. That's pretty significant when you consider, in Washington State, incentives kick in when you're 15 points above your target. This building was almost three times that, over double. So they had a lot of work, a lot of useful life projects that needed to be prioritized in budgeting process in order to meet their 2027 compliance date. So their compliance date's upon them. We've developed these bundles of work. So the biggest thing is developing these bundles of work. The gentleman in the audience was talking about performance contracting. They chose performance contracting as a delivery model. And so that is an example of how what both Oregon and Washington have as the energy services performance contracting legislation, how that can be applied to the private sector industry in the form of energy services agreement. It basically complies with the legislation in the public sector, but it's the private sector delivery model. And that's oftentimes referred to as an energy services agreement, which can deliver these bundles of work to get a customer below its, a building owner below its target. But the biggest challenge was finding the funding. Right? This was a $25 million capital investment project. They're doing it over three phases. They're into phase 2. They've raised capital for phase 3. And I think the rest of this conversation today in this workshop is really talking about how do you create that capital stack that includes incentives. So this building's got over 30% of its capital funds are from incentives, both from the local utility, the state, and what they call the Clean Buildings and the Early Adopter Incentive Fund, which has been ratcheted up by almost 3 times of what the legislation was built around. So it's basically giving them 3 times more money, close to $1 million in additional funding, in addition to what we got from the utility, and then also looking at other forms of capital funding, which is private equity and debt, to be able to fund the difference that we can't get from incentives and grants. So that was a long way to get to your answer, Devesh. So apologize for that, but I think the context was important going forward.
Great to have an example, illustrative example of how it all plays out. Certainly, I just want to make a note on a technical side. I think bundled has come up, bundling of energy conservation measures over and over. As an energy practitioner, super important, I think, to just kind of talk a bit about why that's important. I know, Blake, you mentioned it too. Does someone want to comment? Like, I think we have providers here maybe of solutions. Maybe we think about if you just were to do the lighting or the windows or the HVAC, it's probably not the best idea. It's better to put them together. Maybe someone wants to comment on. Yeah, go ahead.
We just finished up a college over in Southern Virginia, and they called us for about 1 megawatt of power on their gymnasium. And when we went out there to do the site survey, we ended up ordering a forensic utility audit. They're a nonprofit. We have direct pay that's available to them. But we ended up going with a PPA. The PPA folks ended up getting a REAP grant to do this project. But we ended up redoing all of their lights, all of their HVAC, put in a bank of chargers at their dorms, another bank of level 2 chargers, all networked. And what I found very interesting was the water conservation piece around it. We went ahead and retrofitted. There's a wonderful company. I don't want to. We can talk if you have any questions, but we were able to reduce this college's water consumption on those toilets by 60% within 90 days of us shaking hands to get this deal done. And so what it did is it built credibility for us moving into these other renewable projects, and we ended up packaging it all together. And there you go.
And that's the key here, because then you can also size systems right. The solar will be sized right, the HVAC will be sized right, and that bundled retrofit achieves that. But then, of course, it's a larger piece to finance, right? And that's why we're going to shift gears now and go into the incentives and the finance side of it, because it's critical to have the capital to do that. I've seen it in my own experience with CPACE financing. You can get the bundled piece done, and you can throw in prepaid maintenance. But let's go ahead and shift gears and talk a bit more about just sort of what are the stressors in the market right now. And we'll start with Rob, but we want to cover credit markets. We can have all the stuff going on in the policy world. We can have the challenges in our environmental heat waves, the stressors, electrification, but we also have a credit market, a capital market that operates in its own world, and we're trying to connect all of it. So maybe you can talk, Rob, about stressors on that end, and we can go into some of the other stressors with the rest of the panel. So
yeah, I think most people, if you're paying attention to the news, besides the election, Jerome Powell's probably the most watched person in the marketplace on what's going to happen with interest rates. One of the big stressors for a lot of my clients, obviously, is we've seen, we had the triple whammy, I call it, in 2022, where Fed raised rates 75 basis points, 75 basis points, 75 basis points, boom, boom, boom. And so a lot of projects that were underdeveloped at that point couldn't get financed anymore. So that's been a challenge. Again, I joke, I don't know if 2022 is the greatest time to start my own firm on helping clients raise capital and find debt, but certainly there's been a lot of demand and a lot of need. And then when you talk about performing building standards, certainly from a construction standpoint, we've seen, with inflation, seen huge escalation in cost. I mean, I don't have a project that isn't 10% over, at least 10% over what the original budget was. So on the lending side, one of the things I always try to focus on is that, where are we at with the budget, and making sure that we're updating those things. Because again, very, very challenging on the bank debt side. One of the things, is everybody familiar with CPACE? Hopefully, and if not, I mean, I can do a quick explanation on it. But CPACE was adopted in Deschutes County. Was it 2022, 21? Was it that long ago? Okay. Yeah. But in the state of Oregon, I'm throwing numbers out there. I think it was 2017 or 18 was actually approved in the state of Oregon. And one of the CPACE itself is what I call a private, public partnership, because basically the county is the tax assessor. CPACE capital providing is an assessment. So it winds up being an assessment. Capital providers across the country on the CPACE side, basically, there's an annual assessment where they're taking that CPACE payment and monetizing that to repay debt. So essentially, that the county is giving its authority to a CPACE capital provider to assess a property. And when a bank comes in to partner with that, the bank has to consent to have that assessment lien on there. I think there's a lot of confusion. Banks are like, well, we're in second position, and the reality is, I call it pari passu, because overall, the same as property taxes, if they're not paid, can prime a senior bank loan, which means if you don't pay it, that could be ahead of a bank loan. So same with CPACE, as long as you're paying the annual CPACE assessment related to, and it works like debt. Again, it's an assessment, but it really works like debt. And from a bank underwriting standpoint, it's not it's not magic. You just can't ignore it. Essentially, it is like debt service. And some folks argue whether it's above the line or below the line. Above the line just means, hey, we're showing that similar property taxes. Below the line means it's, we've got to cover that in our debt service. So, banks still need to cover that in the debt service side of that. Certainly leverage wise, CPACE allows you, it's a CPACE in the state of Oregon. And I think Deschutes is, pretty much all the counties that have adopted CPACE for so far in the state of Oregon, which I think there's only 4. Multnomah County was the first county to adopt CPACE. Deschutes, I think, was second. Washington County just adopted it. And then Hood River County, I think, is the other. And there may be some new counties on there, but different than the state of, I live in Washington. So in the state of Washington, CPACE was adopted in, I think it was 2021. But most of the major counties have already adopted it. And so you have to have the county adopt it too, which can take a while. But the benefit again, and up to 30% of qualified cost, whether you're building new construction or you're retrofitting a building, up to 100% of those costs, up to 30% of the total building value can actually be covered by CPACE. So that sounds great. On the other side, the challenge has been, especially for me on working with my clients, is finding banks that will consent to it and allow that additional leverage on the property. Because again, the governor here is not necessarily loan to cost. I mean, if you're a developer builder, loan to cost is a big issue. Loan to value is another issue, but it's really the governor has been that debt service coverage ratio. And so as banks are getting, we're seeing rates come down. Obviously, I think, we see the 10-year treasury, I think is 370 or something today or yesterday. So we've seen that come down, it was over 5 at one point. So we've seen that come down significantly. So that's helping on the underwriting side. It's helping hitting some of those capital stacks. A lot of banks still are not overly comfortable having leverage more than total leverage, including CPACE, more than 75% of loan to cost. So that's been a challenge, but we're starting to see with the interest rates coming down, banks getting a little more comfortable with construction lending if it's on the new side. CPACE originally, and Devesh, you can pop in here, but I think CPACE originally was designed for retrofitting buildings, existing buildings. It's been stretched to help with new construction, but back in the day, if I was lending 5% on a multifamily project and PACE was 7.5%, my clients would say, well, PACE looks good, but why would I do that, Rob? If you can finance the whole thing, why would I have CPACE in there? So now actually CPACE more recently has been actually more cost effective and actually cheaper than bank debt on the construction side and on the new debt side. So we've seen that dynamic change, and it's going to continue to change over the next 24 months, where I think CPACE is going to be more prevalent. But that's the benefit of CPACE, is it allows you to finance that. It's a long-term fixed rate instrument, stays with the building. So again, you can buy and sell the building and it can stay in place. You don't have to pay that off. So if you have a building, you put CPACE on there, you sell the building, the buyer can actually leave that CPACE in place because it's tied to that property. And I think if you go back, good examples, go to New York City and see, when you're talking about trying to retrofit those old buildings and some of the performing building standards that we're putting in place. Right now, the building owners are getting fined because they can't hit those building performance standards in New York City. And so that's where CPACE was originally put together. So I think when we talk about performing building standards for existing buildings, I think we're going to be able to utilize CPACE a lot more, but there's a lot of misunderstandings, miscommunication on, how CPACE works. So,
yeah, thank you, Rob. And I'll just add, I think it's important to think about a developer's pro forma and how all this, like you talk about the penalties now, they're saying, well, make sure you include the potential future penalty and how you calculate the pro forma financials for that building that you're building or that existing building retrofit that you're doing. So I think there's 2 business cases for PACE. It's a new construction where you sort of have an off-balance sheet, potentially off-balance sheet sort of source of capital, non-recourse, which is important, to fill in some of that stack that normally would be filled in this past few years market by equity, right, Rob? Largely because the banks have delevered down to 60, 65, whatever that might be.
Yeah, where we used to be lending 75, 80% loan to cost. I mean, banks these days are maybe 60, 65, and they'll allow PACE to come in a little bit more than that overall, but it's still very, very, very tight, which again, it forces more equity. And on top of that, we've had escalating, capital, cost increases on new construction, and building retrofit. So that's been a challenge to try to balance increased costs from an inflationary standpoint and increased costs from a debt service standpoint. So that's been a big impact to talk about stressors, and that's been a big impact to a lot of my clients. And when you think about some projects, the other thing I'm finding too is some projects that have been on hold, everybody's like, oh, we're ready to go now. But the reality is when they go back to look at the cost structure of that, they can't make it pencil anymore. So they've got to go back to the drawing board and raise more equity and or look at maybe CPACE as an option.
Very good. Maybe I'll just show a quick case study about how these benefits play out. Yep.
Just real quick.
Yep.
Since it is election season, fact check. You were way closer. It was past August 2022.
22. Okay.
Yes.
That's what I thought. Okay.
Good to know. Yeah. Excellent. So, when you do a new construction project, as Rob said, you tend to have also the deferred payment. There's some other advantages to think about with PACE. The long-term financing allows you to really get the cash flows to work out as well. But in an existing building, which is what PACE was, as you said, kind of engineered for, you really can see the benefits. You can really see that net operating income of your existing building change, as you just mentioned with that retrofit of that property. This is a near net zero office retrofit in Maryland, where what happened was you had an engineering firm that had a solution for battery energy storage, solar control systems to manage between the grid and the building and to optimize it to get to a near net zero. But the cost of it was going to be about half of the building value, like 3.7 million to get it done. And it's like, well, where do we get that kind of capital, right? And what they were able to do is by using CPACE, all of that money didn't represent any kind of equity, any CapEx outlay from the ownership, but they were able to increase their property value by 4.7 million, just based on the equipment alone. But then you have the NOI impact, the net operating income. Now you have revenue, now you have energy savings, and all that gets into the pro forma for the next 20 years or so. And you've got a way to manage that load in a way that you can track it and manage it successfully. And so just a quick summary. And so what we see right now going on, I think, in the world of energy management buildings is this idea of savings all the way to revenue. And in this case, tenants, you have loyal tenants, you can plug that into your pro forma. You've got less tenants having to be renewed or having to bring in new tenants, and that can save you money. But owner benefits, increased value, incentives, rebates, and a depreciation. So some things to think about. We can go deeper on this, but we should probably shift over. Any comments, questions around PACE? I know you've heard about it before, but it's growing. Certainly a solution to get to the targets for sure, right? One of the solutions. I guess, what are the other constrained stressors has everybody else seen beyond just we talked about the credit market, capital markets, but what about our grid? And what are some other drivers around what we need to be aware of as building owners, for example, in the Northwest? Maybe anyone comment on that?
Specific to the grid?
The grid's relation to to real estate development, I guess.
Yeah, certainly. Actually, this might somewhat relate to the Oregon Department of Energy program, but I am kind of curious. One of the biggest stressors on the grid right now, and what's really worrying some of our utilities are the data centers, coming into our regions, and those data centers, certainly will, lead to the grid being stressed, which might result in increased rates, for the rest of us, and then also might lead to additional ways that the utilities will need to manage their grid. And so if anything, it just kind of heightens the importance to all of these programs that we're talking about to reducing our overall energy use, to ensure that our grid can actually take the growth that it's seeing, and also just the type of growth that it's seeing. Yeah. So I don't know. My question for Blake was about how would a data center fit into the building standards that you're proposing?
Right. Yeah. So, certainly I think similar to a lot of locations around the country, Oregon is becoming attractive for a lot of data centers to be built, particularly like in some areas of the state too. How a data center would fit into building performance standards. So we already have a separate energy code for data centers. So anything that's built to that's a newly constructed data center would need to meet an ASHRAE standard 90.4. So it's already going to be like about as efficient kind of industry standard level of energy efficiency. But with regard to how it fits into building performance standards, if it's over that covered building threshold, it would still be a covered building, but we don't have a specific target for data centers. So it's a covered building without a target. So it would follow the investment criteria pathway in terms of conducting an energy audit, implementing that optimized bundle of energy efficiency measures, and then complying through that pathway. So.
Okay, that's. Sorry about that. Yep.
I just want to follow up on that. Slide, I think we saw earlier this morning where they have the labs, data centers, and the fact that it's not the building itself, but it's what types of use are in the building. How does this program align with that? Because it seems to me like you got the most building in the world, but what's happening inside the campus? So how are you approaching that? Not you, in that sense.
Right. Yeah. So there are a number of exemptions for property types like industrial and agricultural and manufacturing. So if you've got a building with a high process load, like with the things that are happening inside the building, where a lot of the energy use is not driven by the shell and like your typical just climate control operations aspects of like an office building or another sort of commercial building, those buildings could be eligible for an exemption. Otherwise, if there's some unique energy using feature within the building that just makes that target an unrealistic target for that building, where it just doesn't match the average for the other building types in that category, in that building occupancy class, then it would still, again, just follow that investment criteria pathway, where it would still need to do an energy audit to determine what it's what potential measures could be applied to that building. But if that target isn't the right target for that building, it has that compliance pathway to follow too. Does that make sense? Does that kind of address the question a little bit?
If you don't mind, Blake, I think I can build on what Blake said. Yes. I think what you're talking about is like when you have a typical most buildings are just not one activity type, right? You might have a brewery as part of it. So the brewery process is unique to the front of house, right? Where your administration, your office area is at. And by the way, you might be, a microbrewery with a restaurant, right? So now you got a restaurant facility all in the same building envelope, right? Not uncommon in the microbrewery industry. So what the law allows us to do, and this is some of the work that Blake's working on that will be published next year, is come up with a weighted or a calculated energy use intensity target based on the activity types that are within the enclosure. And I think that's really what you want to do. And very seldom do we walk into a building in Washington State that's just one activity type. There are out there, but most buildings have multiple activity types that are functions that are happening within that enclosure. And so those need to be taken into consideration. That's why the law is requiring, I'll stand up. That's why the law in both states require a defined term known as a qualified person to be able to go and assess what activity type applies to the building. And basically they have the credentials and they're signing off on all the documentation that it's accurately reflected in the data. And so that's part of the process. That's part of the initial benchmarking process I referred to earlier. That's where that would come into play. The other thing I would see in this experience in Washington State is the definition of gross floor area. What's your floor area? If you're a property manager, your definitions of floor area are different than what Energy Star and what the legislation in Oregon State defines floor area. It's basically the exterior dimensions of your property, less any parking space, and any kind of floor area that may be multi-floor without a floor, right? So like the double atrium entries that many office buildings in downtown Portland have, where you might have a 2-floor entry atrium. That space on the second floor that you can't put your feet on is excluded from the calculation. But everything else, stairwells, elevator rooms, machine rooms, data closets, all the shafts and everything else that are within those exterior enclosure is defined as gross floor area. And what we're finding is that there's significant misunderstanding on how to apply the definitions. And when you're calculating your energy use intensity target, and if you recall, Blake mentioned that EUI is energy use intensity is total annual energy spend divided by the floor area. So if you get the denominator wrong, you're working off an inaccurate result. And that's why the benchmarking process, what I can't emphasize enough, is critically important to make sure you get that correct, the data correct in Energy Star Portfolio Manager, and that you get your space activity types or space uses identified correctly. And ASHRAE Standard 100 defines 113 activity types. So if you look at Blake's, the state's draft rules, you'll see 113 unique energy use intensity targets for all the different activity types that are defined by ASHRAE Standard 100.
Thank you for that clarification. Who's familiar with Energy Star Portfolio Manager? Have you used it on your properties? Okay, because if you probably get a lot of this about the gross floor area, what's the predominant use in the building, et cetera. But plenty of opportunity to follow up on that. It's something that there's plenty of webinars as well. I want to acknowledge these sort of black swan things. We talked about the data centers. We had the pandemic. The bottom line, though, is if you've got a building that's energy efficient, you can actually survive through these scenarios quite well. But we have to come together as building owners to deal with the data center issue. I will mention that I was part of an effort with Urban Land Institute to get a grant awarded on grid resiliency in the Northwest to bring building owners and utilities together. So I'd like to invite everybody. I can feel free to reach out to me to be involved in the deployment of that program to advance and accelerate what we need to see in the market. I want to give time for Andrew to go over incentives, so we'll shift over to that, and then we can do more discussion, have some questions. I know we're getting close on time, so I'll shift to your deck.
Yeah, sure. No, I'll be quick, just because I don't have any specific slides that outline our incentives, but I will just kind of provide an overview of what is available through Energy Trust, and kind of going back to the core thing, and definitely over here in Central Oregon and some parts of the state, our incentives don't necessarily apply because it does come down to who your utilities are. And so you do need to be served by one of the 5 utilities I mentioned before. So over here in Central Oregon, it's Cascade Natural Gas and Pacific Power. Over in Portland, it's Northwest Natural Gas and Portland General Electric. And in Southern Oregon, it's Avista. And so those are the utilities that we serve. So the incentives that I'm talking about are only provided to the ratepayer customers of those utilities. If you're at a co-op or some sort of municipal utility, you probably still have incentives available to you, but it would be through the Bonneville Power Administration or through your local utility that would be administering those BPA utilities. But at any rate, one of the things I also will just say about kind of some of the constraints that we've seen on commercial projects. Energy Trust, we do actually provide services in Southwest Washington as well for Clark County, the Vancouver area. I oversee that commercial portfolio, and some of the things that have really impacted projects over in Washington that we've seen, certainly the inflation, the cost of the projects going up, which leads to a project needing to be rebid. Also, supply chain was a big issue for a little while, so just getting product on site. So both of those things led to projects kind of being pushed out. So timelines of projects were definitely getting expanded. And then kind of another real kind of tactful thing is just labor shortages. We definitely saw that labor shortages were driving costs up and also driving projects out and the timeline of projects. So those are just some things that I figured I'd throw into the conversation just to say, there are some very real things that we know that project managers and construction managers are also facing out there as well, that will impact, the cost of the project and the timing of a project. So to that point, or I guess, kind of along those lines, Energy Trust, we do provide incentives to the commercial sector and to the residential sector, and to, many different types of use types in buildings. We also have programs for industrial, buildings, which tend to be more custom based, and that's to say that representatives will work with building owners and business owners, and we will do assessments on what your current situation is, what sort of capital improvements can be made, and what the ROI is on those capital improvements. So how much will they save you? How much will they cost you? And what's your length of time that it'll take to recoup those costs back? So we provide those services, in most part free of charge, to the business owners. We also will do that for existing building, commercial properties where we'll basically pay for the assessment to happen, to scope out what are those capital improvements that you can make, and then there might be a custom incentive approach to once again kind of figure out what is a kind of a cost per kilowatt or a cost per therm reduction that we can give you to make those improvements. But then we also have a number of prescriptive, if you put in a ductless heat pump, you can get this much amount of money, or if you put in insulation, you can get X number of dollars per square foot, or if you put in new windows, you can get X number of dollars per square foot. We have a whole myriad of incentives, and our incentives are broken out by building type and use type of that building. And really, instead of me going through a lot of slides, I just invite you to go to the website, go to the Energy Trust website, and we've really tried to make the website a lot more user friendly. There were a few years in there where it was kind of a beast, but we've tried hard. I mean, we operate a lot of programs and a lot of different incentives, and they're changing every year. So you can just imagine kind of the work that we do to make sure that information is up to date and available for you all. The other thing I wanted to mention is we provide a platform called Strategic Energy Management, or we just call it SEM. And that's where there are energy coaches who go into buildings or campus type settings. And these energy coaches who are paid for by Energy Trust work with the building operators and the building managers. And we also help, from that, operation and maintenance standpoint, we help, building managers and owners operate their structures more efficiently. And there's a ton of energy savings that can be had just through the proper operation of the buildings. And so much energy savings that it's enough energy saved that it pays for the whole kind of engagement with building owners. And so if you are a building owner, or if you are a part of kind of a campus type setting, you might be able to get your building or your portfolio of buildings entered into what we call a cohort of other building owners. And then these cohorts of building owners work together and go through kind of a 6-month timeframes of this whole curriculum of what it takes to operate your buildings on a more efficient, in a more efficient manner. And that's a great way to save energy and money if you're a building owner, and that's a service that Energy Trust provides.
I think that's even more compelling now if you have a standard, a BPS, and now you have you're reporting your EUI out. How do you take that information and manage your building? You need to have a way to do that. Mm-hmm. So you translate the data into action. It's excellent. Yeah.
And maybe just lastly, I'll say Energy Trust, we have a myriad of residential incentives as well, both for new homes. So if you're a builder building new homes, we have programs for you. If you're a homeowner and wanting to improve your home, we have many different offerings for you as well. So definitely, check out the things we have. And if you are a customer of one of those 5 utilities, like I mentioned, we probably have money for you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I know we didn't touch on IRA incentives, but there's a big strategic move on that if you're a building owner and trying to reconfigure, or you can be public or private, a project to be high performance. The incentives are now set up to really push you in that direction. I want to give some time to Trent, because I know we're running slow on time, but hopefully we'll have some time for people to talk to the panel afterwards as well.
Sure. Sure.
You had a deck that was, let's see here.
This is my 4th day with this company, so a little latitude would be great on your end. So as he's pulling that up, yeah, my background is in commercial real estate valuation, and then since 2009, I've been in renewable energy. And so I've kind of taken, a lot of this is going to be redundant, so I'm going to save some of the redundancies. But are there any real estate people still in the room, and anybody who's doing installation or any type of providers? No? Well, where we build our models is, I kind of use the old real estate model. When I was young in the 70s, he was able to close his own deals. He was his own attorney, the whole 9 yards. And it was the wild, wild west for many years until there were regulations and some professionalism around the people coming out to sell real estate. And if you're old enough to remember that, it was buyer beware. And in my tenure plus in this business, it's been that way too. Is, you know, what we don't want to do is come out there, give quotes, and then race to the bottom price per watt. Nobody wins, right? And so for us, what we like to do is take a look at an overall healthy building. What technologies are available? AI, water conservation. How can we lower bills, your bill, within 90 days of shaking your hand to build credibility? How do we come in and take gravity-fed toilets? And I'll give you a great story. I was in Aruba about 6 months ago and met with the engineer who has about 1,500 rooms that he oversees for Marriott Vacation. One of the cockiest son of a guns I've ever met, until the fourth, he said, "You're not going to find anything here, Trent. You're not going to find anything here." By the fourth toilet, he said, "When can you guys be down to do this?" And so now we're in the process of designing microgrid and some water, other water. They're having an issue with their Bubali plant down there. They're at about 200% of sludge coming into their area. So the point is this, is when you look at the overall health of the building and you come back to PV, which we specialize in here at Earthlight, is, you know, you don't want to size someone at 200% and then them go do all these conservation efforts. You're going to look like a fool. And the brand equity from a long-term brand equity, something you really have to pay attention to. So coming back to my original premise is being a professional in the space and understanding policy and using these guys as a resource. You know, the day of selling solar in the commercial space, I think, is ending. Coming into the commercial space is more about being an educated person, knowing how to value cash flow. For every $10,000 I save you at an 8% cap rate, I'm at $125,000 increased valuation. By that standard, you look at some of these colleges, you're looking at for every 100,000 at an 8% cap rate, and we can debate cap rates all day long, right? But I use 8 because it's safe, but you're still adding $1.25 million to the value of that cash flow that a lot of our industry, we always look at savings. Look what I'm going to save you. Okay, well, the guy down the street said he's going to do it for a penny less. Okay, let's continue to race to the bottom for premium pricing. We can't, and I think if you look at the current state of our business, look at all the people filing Chapter 11 right now. Look at the people that do not have sustainable models. And one of the things I would ask you to ask any of your suppliers or anybody you're dealing with is, how is their economic health? I was at RE Plus. I go every year. And it's amazing how many of those people I know down there that are having trouble paying their phone bill, but they're touting sustainability to multi-million-dollar companies. And I say that with all respect because, you know, sustainability has to start in-house. And for us, you know, I joined Earthlight because I have a 7-year-old daughter who lives here. I wanted to get closer to home. I've been working all over the world, gratefully. But this is a good team. The team believes they have a Connecticut location. They started there, but they have deep roots in the western part of the state. And I'll be now overseeing this side of the state as well. So I'm just happy to be here. Little off script, like I said, we didn't pull up the PowerPoint because a lot of it is redundant. But I wanted to say, if you ever, you know, I'll end with this, is we do connect financing to our projects. We're really well versed in 6417 financing right now for nonprofit. We are a facilitator for that. So instead of just slapping up quotes, we'd like to connect you with funding to a SaaS platform that's going to track everything to completion. And so if there's anything we can ever do to help you there, we do it for profit as well. But I also would like to talk to you after this. We've never met. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about your financing to see if we can complement you in any other areas too. So anyway, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Any questions afterwards, we'll stick around for a little bit. Thank you.
I think it's a good time to go ahead, maybe shift to some questions. It's an additional dialogue in the panel. Please go ahead.
Thank you. You know, really when you're underwriting, looking at the cash flow, and when you're looking at an investor property, you know, utilities generally flow through the tenant, right? And so that savings benefit's going to go to the tenant. How have you seen that translate to the building owner? Because the building owner's putting that capital investment in, but the tenant's benefiting.
We typically will aggregate meters if we can do that and change it from a triple net lease potentially to a gross lease to be able to profit from that. It takes time and it takes leases turning over to be able to be marketable. But if you have a baseline ESG model, which is very polarizing right now, and that was part of the presentation, I would encourage you to look templates because you as a banker, and I'd be interested to know your opinion on this, but there's a lot of validity to having these documented and knowing what type of things you're doing for your community, the marketability in the long run, not to mention the additional value, which is debatable at any given time. It's a really nice place to go. But from my standpoint, when we're looking at a building of his up in Silverton area, we met with them a couple weeks ago, and yeah, I mean, he's an owner occupied, has like 7 or 8 different tenants, and it's about they're all on a triple net lease, and so there are ways to do that to make it beneficial. You always have those owners going, I want to be a power plant. Well, it's about perspective, right? I mean, we can make you think you're a power plant and get the revenue in a different way and legally, right? So there's a lot of hoops to jump through there, but that's how we do it.
I mean, because it ties into both the ability to pay for it over time, because you have that additional cash flow, and also the value, because it's usually the ending approach that's
Right.
to the value.
Right.
And in fact, with the tenant stuff, the pace is really good because it allows the transfer. The owner takes the investment and HVAC and solar, whatever it might be. Transfer that to the lease stuff. It should, one good case that I had was son-in-law for national development. They use commercial things to cover back out, HVAC, right, solar, stuff. And they get 70% of the coverage for the tenant.
They put it in triple net.
Triple net.
CPACE assessment, they put it in triple net.
It's complicated, but we figured about that. They generally figure out that.
No, that's perfect.
We didn't get a chance to talk about IRA. I'm trying to get the slides up on IRA 179, but it's probably we can cover it. Lots of stuff. You all come together. Is there any more questions?
The question for Blake, how will incentives be, or will there be incentives for customers of co-ops? And if, what if a small commercial building, like very small, wanted to go for these standards? Would these be available for incentives, or is it strictly earmarked for 35,000 square feet of house?
Yeah, so it's a good question. So like, would a non-covered building potentially be eligible for the incentives? And I think the answer is yes. You know, we've still yet to stand up and really define what all the criteria are for the incentive program, but our incentives would apply across the state, you know, independent of utility service territory. So it could apply in a co-op or a COU for sure. And then they could be potentially eligible for up to that 85 cents per square foot for early or voluntary adoption of the incentives. And I'm just right now talking about state incentives, the incentives that would come from the Oregon Department of Energy, but there would certainly be opportunities for other utility incentives that might be available from those co-ops or from the COUs, or if they're in investor-owned utility territory from the Energy Trust of Oregon. So, yeah. Or potentially other like federal or you know, other incentives that might be available. Yeah.
Yes, please. No.
Incentives are structured the same way. Projected that gap between actual implementation and actual. Is that brought in at all in structuring incentives? That considered in structuring? Okay. Actual performance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, you know, like I mentioned, we're still kind of defining what the criteria would be for our incentive program, but I think there will be some sort of a component that does require a demonstration of the reductions in energy, you know, not just a projection that you will save energy, but actually achieving those energy use intensity targets to get down to there for that voluntary or early compliance. Yeah.
May I add to that?
Mm-hmm.
There's wonderful SaaS platforms out there right now too that are connected to funding. They're connecting funding, the project, and then to PTO, Banyan Infrastructure out of San Francisco, local resource. And I think they're 30 different countries now or something. They're out in San Francisco, and what they're doing is they're working with Green Bank, started out there. Jigger Shaw came in and started. Are you familiar?
I know Jigger from DC.
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah. So very interesting piece to where it tracks and really the efficiencies and hundreds of thousands of dollars in these big jobs you can save efficiencies, but also tracking your milestones to completion is a really important piece to understand going into this new world of just real data. You know, everything's going to be about data. You know, we need a single source of truth for carbon data and down the line.
And the management of the property, the fault detection, so you get to the energy conservation quicker rather than waiting. As you, as a consultant, you probably know that. And I think that's where, Andrew, you know, having the ability to create capacity in these organizations to manage energy is a big part of that. You can have all the data in the world, but if nobody's actually looking at the potential fault detection.
But not
Yeah.
only that,
You know, so.
what's great about it too, as from a supplier standpoint, is you have a baseline. All of that data is entered into a baseline. What I did with these colleges I worked with. And so we have their water, sewer, gas, and electric baseline in there. And once something comes online, they have an immediate, transparent saying, wow, look, these guys said they're doing what they said they can do. Or, hey, we have a problem.
Yeah.
And it's a transparent data. So if it falls below a certain metric that's set, then of course, somebody, you know, on both sides of the fence they're notified saying, look, we need to take a look at this. Something's not working. Inverter goes out or you know, whatever.
And you have to finance all this stuff. So you could use PACE, you could use ESA and you know, all these different mechanisms to get these capacities into the building ownership, hopefully. Yeah.
I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about on the workforce side of things. Sounding like this is all great. I'm super excited about it. The actual implementation, when you asked even who's familiar with Energy Star portfolio manager, not a lot of hands.
Yeah.
We're going to need energy auditors. We're going to need people that are really actually making this happen. So I'm curious where are the gaps? And the reason I'm asking is within the buildings program, we do a lot of training and a lot of bringing education to the market. Love to help out.
Yeah, go ahead.
You ready? Okay, I'll start, and I think Blake, you can add to this. I think you are exactly correct. There's a piece of this legislation and building performance standards that's called an energy manager. It's a defined term, and it's a responsibility of an individual within that ownership structure of that building that have someone accountable for the sustained management of the energy conservation practices for that business. We find that is a very unfamiliar term to many building owners. If you're not already part of the strategic energy management plan, your campus or a complex of buildings that qualify for that program, if you're outside of that type, if you're an individual building owner, you're not going to have an energy manager. You don't have a role defined at that. You don't even know what that is, right? So that in itself is that individual within that organization. It could be a service provider providing those services where fault detection and diagnostics, analytics platforms can help provide some of the tasking, the duties of an energy manager in a more cost-effective way. And so that's where those technologies and those types of solutions and also accountability within that organization needs to unfold. A couple of things to respond. I think the Energy Trust has a role in helping with the education and on this. Also, I was just having a conversation earlier this week with Northwest Energy Efficiency Alliance, NEA. To those in the audience that might be familiar with that organization, they are working on some of the workforce development, and they cover both Oregon and Washington. So they have a role in this game of getting the resources out. And then the other organization, which is another nonprofit organization, is called Building Potential. It was formerly known as Northwest Energy Efficiency Council, NEEC. Building Potential is the entity that owns the rights to the building operator certification. So that's one of the credentialing capabilities as a qualified person and qualified energy manager or auditor. That's defined in the laws. So I think it's a matter of leveraging the education and workforce development tools that are out there in the marketplace and getting that word out sooner then the rules are being published and things of that nature, because we're finding a lot of the legacy or the latency in the adoption piece is people don't know what these roles are, or they don't have job classifications for those roles, especially in the public sector. There is no job, those come off of the state's job list of what's acceptable. There's not the pay scale or a job description of an energy manager in any of the public sector, unless they already are participating in a strategic energy management program and they have got an incentive to create a role for that function. So that's really important.
Thank you. We're over time, but it seems like first I want to please round of applause for the panel.